Poland has become the new military superpower of Europe, and with incredible pace. Warsaw's armed forces are now the third largest in Nato. Its defence spending per head is the highest in the alliance, outstripping even America's. Why has this happened? How have they managed to do it? Keir Starmer, take note here. And how is it rapidly reshaping Europe's power balance? Welcome to The General and the Journalist. Well, Patrick's not here this week, so I've taken advantage and gone on not one, but two different journalists. So it's the journalist, and the journalist, and both regularly report from Poland. Oliver Moody, the Times' Berlin correspondent, who was with us back on the podcast in November, and Bartosz Kurlak, who grew up in Poland and witnessed his country's pretty extraordinary transformation firsthand. Bartosz and Ollie, hello. Thank you for joining me.
Hello.
Dzień dobry.
That's excellent. The translation, Ollie?
Good day.
Right. That's my first word of Polish. We move onwards in that spirit. Bartosz, the extraordinary transformation your country has seen in just 35 years since it was behind the Iron Curtain, part of the Soviet bloc. What was it like in Poland back in the 1990s?
Well, the winters were definitely colder. I remember the cigarette smoke and the grey landscapes and terrible trains, dirty trains. Do you know what? Like my grandparents' generation, they fought for democracy, they fought for freedom. I feel like my parents' generation felt a bit lost in all that. You know, every man and woman for themselves, and not necessarily everyone found themselves in this new reality. So it was a time of economic hardships. It was time of widespread poverty, especially the early 90s. It was a time of a lot of Western brands and big Western enterprise being warmly embraced by the Polish government and taking over big swaths of the economy. And then, then was the rapid modernization, Poland access, first NATO, then the EU. And I kind of feel like, I was around 10 when Poland entered the EU. From that time onwards, it's slowly but steadily started getting a lot better.
And Ollie, you go backwards and forwards to Warsaw and other Polish cities quite a bit. Can you visibly see life changing for Poles, improving almost sort of year by year, the availability of all Western goods, Western cars now? That's pretty much normal, I'd imagine, is it? Where previously they would drive around Trabants and Skodas and Ladas.
So I have to say I was not in Poland in the 1990s or the 2000s to see the sort of post-communist ruin that Bartosz was describing. But in the sort of 7 or 8 years that I have been visiting Warsaw and other large Polish cities, you can definitely see this this kind of great convergence with Western European cities in terms of the infrastructure, even in terms of the sort of hipsterization that's now taking hold of places like Gdańsk on the Baltic coast or central Warsaw, the kind of middle-class coffee shops and so on.
Ollie, on the extraordinary military transformation, one fact alone in our research really stood out with me. Poland currently has some 612 main battle tanks. That's a vast amount, 3 times the amount of the UK's. It's soon going to increase to 1,100 main battle tanks, which is going to be more and considerably more than the UK, France and Germany all put together. But to understand that, to understand the journey, I think we need to go back to what's happened to the Polish economy, don't we? Which is in itself a pretty extraordinary miracle when you think back to the 30 years ago of the lawlessness and the depressions of the 1990s.
You absolutely do. And like pretty much every other economy in the former Eastern Bloc that moved into the EU, Poland had an extreme roller coaster of a transition in the 1990s where deregulation really did lead to a bit of a huge centrifuge of wealth, with some people prospering enormously and a lot of people, particularly outside the big cities, feeling very left behind and even struggling in many cases to put food on the table despite having what were ostensibly quite respectable middle-class jobs. But certainly since Poland joined the European Union in 2004, the economy has just put in an absolutely extraordinary spell of almost unbroken growth. And the only year in which GDP has not grown was 2020, the first year of the pandemic. And even then, I think it only declined by about 2%. And it's just been banging out the growth figures with a consistency that even countries like the Baltic states have failed to match.
That Beijing would be jealous of even. The numbers are just amazing, aren't they? And in fact, on their current trajectory, they're going to overtake the UK, have a big annual GDP in 2031. In Warsaw, the average income, 67,000 euros a year, matched only really by London across Europe in terms of prosperity. How have they done this in such a short period of time?
Well, one really important thing to point out is that these figures that we have been triumphantly quoting are PPP. They are purchasing power parity adjusted, which basically means how much bang do you get for your zloty. But the PPP figures are astounding, right? They are on course to overtake Japan pretty soon, followed by Spain and New Zealand in terms of living standards. I think Israel is also on the list of countries they're about to catch up with. And in terms of the kind of drivers of that success, it's slightly moot, but it's clear that you have a very highly educated population. You have, despite a certain level of political capture under previous populist governments, some pretty strong institutions. It's a bit intangible, but this is something that Polish economists and business leaders consistently point to, a work ethic that is genuinely on a different caliber to the sort of thing that you would see in Germany or France. And that is also reflected in the number of hours that the average Polish worker will put in every week.
Almost an American style work ethic. I mean, Brits will be obviously very familiar with the wave of Poles who came over here in the last 20 years. 20 years ago, really, Polish plumbers, Polish builders, a very common phenomenon, who did and still do work incredibly hard. But is it just as simple as that they just work so much harder than everyone else in Europe?
Well, the work ethic, I think, is partly something that is embedded in the culture. When Bartosz and I did the research for a big essay on the Polish economic miracle a few weeks ago, this really did come through in every single interview we did, this sense that the fall of communism had presented Polish society with an opportunity to restore the country to what they felt was its rightful place in the front rank of European nations, and they're going to seize it with both hands.
I think one thing that transpired from all the interviews that we did for the essay is that all those people, the senior decision makers, the CEOs, what they always say is that the work ethic and that sort of an entrepreneurial DNA, which you wouldn't necessarily expect from a post-socialist country, has been at the forefront of that success.
And another thing that's happened quite recently is the reverse brain drain. So obviously we're used to large migration from Poland to the UK in terms of workforce. That's now reversing. A lot of Poles are going home on not coming because simply it's a brain gain. The economic prospects in Poland are better than the UK now, Bartosz.
And a massive loss for UK universities, if you don't mind me saying. And currently, there's a steady drip of Poles moving back to Poland from the UK. I think that's roughly 17,000, 18,000 people a year, with about 4,000 still moving to the UK. With the overall number 25,000 outflow, so it's definitely decreasing. It's not nothing like a massive drain, but those people are coming back to Poland. That's a story repeated across Europe. Polish people are moving back to Poland from Germany, from Belgium, from Netherlands, and the job market in Poland seems to be able to accommodate those people. So that's a good thing, but for Poland as well.
And Ollie, you go back and forth to Poland quite a bit. Does Poland now feel like a middle European country, a Western European country, economy-wise?
In some ways, I would say it feels more so than Germany does. You particularly notice that in the levels of digitization. Every time I get any kind of communication from the German authorities, it is in the form of a letter that has usually been sent 2 weeks before I receive it, and requests a reply before it even turns up in my letterbox. Whereas in Poland, the level of digital infrastructure, I would say, is at the very least comparable to the UK's, if not slightly ahead of it.
So Poland is more Germanically efficient than Germany?
The myth of German efficiency is the subject for another podcast episode.
We'll come back to that. Bartosz, this isn't the first Polish Golden Age. Right now, that's what it's being called, isn't it? The Polish Golden Age. Actually, your country has had several Golden Ages and vast empires, if you go back 300, 400, 500 years. The Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth of 1569 to 1795, in particular, springs to mind.
Well, They call it a silver age now, since we're living through the golden age. That's a bit of a political spin on those things. But yeah, Poland was probably one of the strongest countries in Europe at the time, definitely one of the wealthiest. All of its grain production giving it immense wealth, the Gdańsk port being called a golden city due to all the grain it exported at the time. And even at one point, Polish armies made it to Moscow, conquered Moscow, and tried to install its own Tsar on the Russian throne, although unsuccessfully. So that's one for the history books.
And I think I'm right in saying that Poland is the only country ever to have actually successfully conquered Moscow.
And they do still remember it, that they reminisce from time to time in Moscow every year. That act of aggression against Russia on behalf of Poland. Poles are not that attached to that sort of mythical ideology of fighting Russia, but still that's a very important fact in Russian history.
If I can interject, there is another more recent period of absolutely electric Polish military power that often tends to get a bit forgotten in the UK, and that is immediately after the First World War, when Poland fought this completely epical war against the Soviet Union and turned back the Red Army on the Vistula near Warsaw in 1920. Really one of the great turning points in modern European history that's just sort of been memory hold in Western Europe.
My family members fought in that war. I found historical...
Against the Bolsheviks?
Indeed, so I found historical documents, being stationed to particular battalions involved in that campaign. And I think it all broke down to Poles deciphering Russian radio codes and then being able to predict movements of the Russian army. It all came down to the Battle of Vistula, I think 1920, 1921. And that pushed against the Soviet vision of spreading revolution to the West. So indeed, a very, very important battle.
That's an interesting story, isn't it? A familiar one of a somewhat smaller Russian neighbour outwitting the Russians, almost reminiscent of what might be going on today nearby. But the Russian analogy is kind of interesting, isn't it, Oliver?
The Russians certainly have formed towards their entire Western neighbourhood. But absolutely, Poland was partitioned off the face of Europe at the end of the 18th century by Prussia, Russia, and Austria. And there was a very intense campaign of Russification in the Russian-controlled part of Poland. There are absolutely very deep and alive historical memories of everything that being occupied by Russia means.
Fascinating. Which neatly brings us to Poland's military and the incredible growth of it. Ollie, just flesh out the size of Poland's military today and the current spending for us, if you can.
It's, I think, 4.8% this year, on a trajectory to go over 5%, which would put it, if not number one in NATO, then up there alongside places like Estonia and Lithuania. In absolute terms, it's about 45 billion euros a year, which is pretty considerable. They are affording, off the back of that, armed forces of 216,000 professional soldiers, plus a fairly sizable reserve and a territorial defence force, that gigantic fleet of tanks that you mentioned earlier. They are clearly using this money in a pretty efficient way and getting quite a lot more value for some of their investment than Western European militaries do.
The British Army has some 72,000 soldiers compared to the Poles' 200,000 plus, and that is to grow to 300,000. So it's soon going to be 4 times the size of the British Army, which is absolutely extraordinary. And Bartosz, one of the ways that Poland is now growing this, a new development last year, is the introduction of compulsory military training. In fact, we talked with Ollie in some detail about this in a podcast we did on conscription all over Europe, how it's coming back in November. How is this working? Every man of adult age at some stage has to do a year's military service, is that right?
Well, the moment I turned 18, I was called into a military commission, and they've gauged my physical prowess. They gave me an A-class. That's a little military book that I have somewhere, probably still kept in family documents back in Poland. It is illegal to remove that document from the Polish territory.
Right.
And that means that should I be called into conscription, I would have to serve.
And the Polish Reserve, the intention is to grow to the point where the regulars and the reserve come up to some 500,000 troops. And that's just a huge amount. Fine. Their Russian neighbours have 1.2 million regular soldiers. They're fighting a big war with Ukraine, of course, but that's still an enormous land force, which, Ollie, begs the question why. I mean, there's the huge elephant sitting to Poland's east, obviously, or the bear, I guess we should put it. But why has Poland done such a massive increase in its military in really not much more than 4 years?
Well, it's a story that goes back probably a decade, really, to the aftermath of the Russian annexation of Crimea in 2014, and a sense that Eastern Europe was becoming a much more dangerous place, and that Poland had to be set up fundamentally to defend itself.
Poland woke up to the Russian threat very, very early on, 2008, the invasion of Georgia. And still, the Bush administration and Obama administration was kind of diplomatically open to working with Russia. Several Polish prime ministers were towing that line and maintaining sort of a lively diplomatic relationship with Russia. But after 2008, that invasion of Georgia, that slowly started to change. And definitely a final wake-up call was that invasion of Ukraine, showing that you cannot really negotiate with Putin. Anything that you sign with Putin is not really worth the paper it's been written upon. And yeah, Poland really needed to arm up fast.
So it sounds like a mixture between the history, a long series of examples of wars between Russia and Poland ingrained in people's consciousnesses, and the modern day. Ukraine is just over the Polish border. There's 200 or so miles of a border it shares with Ukraine. The war in Ukraine is very, very real indeed in Poland.
And the political narrative would be that the Ukrainians are fighting for our freedom and our safety and our defense. There's also the aspect of very sober assessment of successive political leaders in Poland, both on the right-wing side, the Law and Justice Party that's been in power up until 2024, and the current government, that indeed Polish defense and security is inseparably tied to the preservation of Ukraine as an independent sovereign state that can defend itself from Russia.
Ollie, when I was driving through Poland, it became very obvious that this really was quite a militarized place. You saw long convoys of Polish military on motorways, people in uniform in service stations, sometimes US military, European militaries, all transporting stuff to Ukraine, to the front, to help our allies there. And this is really a country not at war, but really not too far away from one.
Absolutely. And as if a reminder of that were needed, we got a very sharp one last September when about 20 or maybe 22 Russian sort of Gerber 2 type drones encroached on Poland's airspace. And about 4 of them were shot down with very expensive air-to-air missiles by Dutch F-35s. But the other ones just made it straight through. And some of them got hundreds of kilometers. Some of them went west of Warsaw and got very close to military installations. So I think that has very much underlined the sense of unrelenting, what we call hybrid or sub-military pressure, and the sense that this is continually inching up the escalation ladder towards something really serious.
What was known as grey zone warfare, which we've seen a bit of in Britain, but particularly there was an extraordinary incident, wasn't there, where a railway was bombed in last November in Poland, a railway line. In fact, 2 different explosions. The act of Ukrainian saboteurs under the pay of Russia's FSB.
That's correct. This has been a pattern that we've really seen since a large number of GRU military intelligence officers operating under diplomatic cover were kicked out of Europe's embassies. And so the GRU and the FSB, apparently also through the Wagner private military company as intermediaries, have taken to hiring poor or disaffected or bored young Poles or members of the Belarusian or Ukrainian diaspora, and getting them to do what I've come to think of almost as grey zone spam. So that's things that could range from spraying offensive or sort of hateful slogans under motorway underpasses to petty acts of arson, all the way up to blowing up the main railway line to the city of Lublin. And the scale of this constant activity has been growing pretty remorselessly over the past 2 years or so.
And the frequency of those incidents has actually allowed the Polish secret services, in cooperation with Western partners and allies, to develop a sort of a cookbook, a modus operandi for the Russian services as they currently operate in Europe. You know, using actual physical advertisements on bus stops or road signs, or recruiting through Telegram and WhatsApp. Finding people in economic hardship, first asking them to do little menial tasks such as, photographing particular objects, then slowly gearing them up to perform those acts of sabotage. I interviewed the Deputy Minister of Poland last year responsible for that. He says that there's a 24/7 direct line to the Prime Minister in case of those incidents in Poland, and they observe around 300 of those a day. So that's a very serious issue.
That playbook of Russia's, which is a new thing actually, using proxies almost directly out of the Iranian playbook of building up a Hamas or Hezbollah, a more organised military, for a really interesting and alarming development. We're actually going to turn to in an episode in a week or two's time on that specifically. Ollie, this extraordinary military transformation that Poland has undergone, though, the other great question is, how on earth have they paid for it all?
That's a very good question. And the answer is partly that they have just ordered in massive bulk, in particular from South Korea, these gigantic numbers of K2 Black Panther tanks or K9 howitzers with a certain element of local production. And they're just doing that at a scale, off the shelf, in a way where the Germans are still stuck ordering kind of boutique numbers of bespoke, exquisite platforms. The other answer is that Poland is just borrowing lots and lots of money. It's opened up, I believe, the second largest deficit in the European Union. So a large amount of this is being paid for against the future income of Polish generations to come.
And is cutting spending in different areas.
Such as
education, for example. It's only 1% of the budget going towards education, which is pointed to as a massive problem. But in conversation with the Estonians and with Poles alike, both countries have this massive digital ID system, which we both wrote about 40 times. And the Prime Minister of Estonia has told me it allows them to save around 3% GDP every year, just because of how smoothly it allows the administration, the state administration, to operate. And I think that's one of the sources of that extra expenditure in Poland as well.
And in a word, Ollie, all this vast amounts of extra military spending, even if you're taking out the education and health budgets, that's pretty popular amongst Poles, is it?
It is popular, but I think it's important to mention one gigantic fly in the ointment that has really surprised me, which is the willingness of the population to take up arms and fight against an invader or on behalf of an ally. And it is a cliche that the further you go towards Russia, the more that number goes up. So in Finland, for example, where they've got deep memories of the Winter War in 1939, 1940, it sort of fluctuates around 80% of the entire population. And if you go through Estonia, it's well over 50%, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, it's actually falling. And I believe in the last survey, it was around 40% of the population, which is not that much higher than it is in Germany.
I'll go even further west and compare this to Keir Starmer, who is desperately struggling to try and increase Britain's own defence spending up to 2.5%. We won't get into it now, but he still hasn't said how he's going to pay for that promised increase next year. And that is half where Poland's defence spending is.
I mean, when I've spoken to Polish officials about this, there is, of course, a certain amount of understanding that Britain and France are fiscally in a really tight spot just because their debt to GDP levels are around 100%. They're so much higher than Poland's is.
That's fascinating. Poland has clearly got a bit more leeway when it comes to fiscal headroom, as the phrase goes.
But the other side of that is that there is also a tremendous sense of frustration with the British and the French. If your military leadership has got the message, why is the political leadership not following suit despite those constraints that the Treasury obviously faces?
Yeah, it's a theme we like to talk about on this podcast. Let's get to the consequences of all this, though. This extraordinary military transformation. Ollie, how is this changing the power play in Europe now, the balance of power, this new vast military superpower in the East?
This is actually a harder question to answer than you'd think, because the kind of instinctive response would be, well, of course they bought themselves a seat at the top table. And it's very difficult now for the Germans to convene a meeting of the really big players in Europe without inviting the Poles. They've had to contrive entirely new diplomatic formats just to make sure that the Poles and the Brits are sitting at the table. That's one side of the answer. But the other side of the answer is that for all the talents of the Polish Foreign Service, I think there hasn't quite been enough joined up diplomacy to convert all that military strength into diplomatic clout.
You're right. It's the big four now. It's no longer just Britain, France, and Germany. In fact, it used to be Britain and France a couple of years ago. Then it was Britain, France, and Germany. Now it's Britain, France, Germany, and Poland. So, they have a seat, and sooner or later they'll work out how to use that a bit better.
I mean, in military terms, the transformation is extraordinary, to the point where we're talking about the Americans handing over the job of Supreme Allied Commander Europe to the Europeans. And in the first instance, they talk about a German. Who do they talk about next? A Polish general. And again, we're talking about the Americans possibly handing over command of the joint NATO command centre at Brunson, responsible for the defence plan for Central Europe. Again, a general from Germany or Poland. The fact that Polish names are coming to consideration for these really absolutely pivotal posts in NATO tells you everything you need to know about the amount of respect they've earned themselves in purely military power terms.
In recent months, the German Chancellor has suggested there should be a new format within the European Union that would involve Spain, France, Germany, Belgium, and Poland and Italy, leaving some of the other countries out and creating that sort of a primary leading group of European countries. And that kind of shows you the new position of Poland. And the governmental camp in Poland would very much like to see that European defense built together with other European nations and less reliant on US support, because as we found out in recent years, especially as in case with Denmark and Greenland, it's not as reliable as we always thought it might be.
There's one other element of Poland's military that's a very, very live debate. In fact, it's getting a lot of attention as a result of President Nawrocki's interview on a television station on Sunday, and that's a nuclear arsenal. So Poland has been kicking around the potential of this hypothetically for really a few years now. Do we need to start becoming a nuclear power? Can we rely on an American deterrent to protect us still, or the French or the Brits? The president said very actively, we do need one. We need to get on with building our own right here and now.
We had several of our sources within Polish government have suggested last year that Poland is very strongly encouraging Americans to give some of its nuclear arsenal to Poland, but the requirements put forward by the Americans weren't able to be met by the Polish side. So Poland is trying to get nuclear weapons. It's probably not able to develop them on its own because it doesn't have any uranium anymore. Soviets took it all. But it's definitely trying.
What Bartosz is talking about there, in case it isn't clear to listeners, is nuclear sharing.
Yeah,
it's the same arrangement that Germany and Italy and Belgium and Turkey have with the Americans. So it would not be the Polish Prime Minister with his finger on the red button. And I think the idea of Poland developing a nuclear deterrent of its own is just technologically for the birds.
That's interesting. There are two ways to do this. There's nuclear sharing, and President Macron's really leaning into that of late, and there's building your own deterrent. And the lesson from Britain is you build your own deterrent, that's something like 30% immediately of your own defence budget, which is what's really crippling our defence budget at the moment, as vitally important our nuclear deterrent is. But it's still interesting that this is very much part of the narrative now in Polish politics, Ollie.
Yeah, absolutely. And you're also seeing this debate really flaring up in Sweden, of all places, and to a lesser extent in Germany. And the trouble with Europeanising the French deterrent is it all comes down to the question of who's got the codes, who presses the red button in a crisis. Can you imagine a French president ever being prepared to ring Warsaw or Berlin and say, are you guys okay with this? And how on earth that arrangement would work.
Bartosz, how do you see Poland's military superpower status play out? Do they have imperial ambitions of their own? Do they want a seat on the UN Security Council, for example? What happens in 5, 10, 20 years' time?
I think that the ministers, both the presidential ministers and the government ministers, are frequently pointing to G20 as the format in which Poland is seeking to promote itself and find its rightful place as, the 20th biggest economy in the world. And Canada and several other countries, China, have extended to Poland the invitation to join the next G20 summit, not as a member yet, but that's in the works. In terms of any sort of imperial ambitions, I think Poland has definitely conscripted that to the pages of history. What it's seeking to make sure that Russia would absolutely do not dare to encroach on Polish territory, and the way it's doing that is saying it very loudly that Poland is part of NATO, and any attack on Poland would invoke a response from other NATO members.
How do you see Poland developing as a great military power, Ollie? Because so far, the Polish government has been very, very clear this is wholly and entirely a defensive shield, a porcupine strategy rather than an offensive strategy to take the war to Russia, for example.
Yeah, although they will also be increasingly explicit now that if Russia is mad enough to attack them, then they are going to be hammering any number of Russian command and logistics nodes and ammo dumps on Russian territory with their JASSM-ER long-range missiles. I'm gonna go ultra gloomster here because I think we don't spend enough time talking openly about worst-case scenarios. I don't think we collectively in Europe have understood the extent to which this post-war order of peace that we've come to take for granted has been held together by American security guarantees. And I think if and when those security guarantees do fade out of the picture, we could start to see the European project unravel in extremely unpredictable ways. And in that dark vision of the future, military power becomes a form of very hard political currency, not just in terms of kind of winning yourself concessions and bringing allies around you and bringing other countries into your orbit, but also potentially as a form of coercion if we start to see rivalry emerging between European states, which I think is something we really need to start contemplating. And what Poland has done here fundamentally is ensured itself against a version of the future in which it might otherwise be vulnerable to bullying, not just by Russia, but potentially by other neighbouring powers as well.
That's a fascinating point. I could counter that, though, Ollie, and say, actually, your doomsday scenario, and I completely agree, it's a potential. It won't exist if America doesn't leave the fold. We only have 3 more years of Donald Trump's presidency. We had Marco Rubio in Munich last weekend giving a far more conciliatory speech of Europe's our friends, we're not going anywhere. So it may not get that bad. And guess what? The old world order, albeit slightly different and battered, may well continue for many decades more to come. It's a great unknown, but doom is not necessarily the only outcome.
Oh, absolutely. What I'm describing is the worst that things could get. And I think we need to think about that, because we have spent such a long time turning our eyes away from the abyss. And it's something that we need to plan for. And then if in 2028 we get either a more Atlantist Republican president or a Democrat and NATO is somehow patched up, then, all sunshine and rainbows, wonderful. But I do think we need to do our homework now.
In summary, though, Ollie, and this is why geopolitics is such a fascinating subject at the moment, because the future is so unseen and has so many different potential avenues. Poland's massive rearming and new superpower status, it's a good thing, isn't it? They're a force for good.
I think it's profoundly a good thing from the perspective of collective European deterrence. And I would be really hopeful that however dark the future gets, there will still be some coalition of like-minded countries in Europe that can agree that Russia poses the single greatest threat to all of us and that we need to work together to deter it. And in that constellation, Poland will be one of the 2, 3, 4 absolutely decisive players. And so I'm just profoundly grateful that it is as strong as it is. Yeah.
That's another great bonus Poland's remilitarization has given us. You've given us a lead. Where Poland is going, it might well be pretty smart for countries like Britain, France, certainly. Germany's already there, but certainly Britain and France to wake up to this. Bartosz, you're Polish. Your country Your country's new military superpower status, that to you is a pretty good thing, isn't it?
Well, it definitely makes my grandparents feel safer. When I speak to people my age in Warsaw, they are very, very worried about the prospect of Russian aggression, Russian invasion. And the further up north you go, closer to Kaliningrad, the Russian exclave, the more of that you hear, that fear that one day the Russians are going to come. 2 years ago, I spoke to my grandfather, who's a very considerable age. He was born in 1940, and I've asked about his earliest memory. He said that his earliest memory was running through the fields towards a shelter with bullets flying around him. His older sister carrying him on his back, and then hiding in a basement. And one of the women in the basement stood in the doors to look out if there's still danger outside, and she was ripped in half by a large caliber bullet. So that's the earliest memory of my grandfather, who which kind of illustrates that threat of Russian aggression is still very much alive in the Polish memory.
Wouldn't it be wonderful if we actually do learn the lessons of history one of these days after all? Bartosz and Ollie, thank you so much. Your wisdom and your knowledge and learning is hugely valuable. That was a really interesting conversation. Thank you for joining me.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Well, that's it. Patrick is back next week when we'll be speaking to a very interesting guest that I suspect the country will hear an awful lot more from in the near future. In the meantime, please email us, generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk. generalandjournalist@thetimes.co.uk is our email address. Your thoughts, your questions, we read everyone and they're really, really useful. Also, the War and Peace newsletter out every Thursday, free to Times subscribers. Just sign up to that on the website, written by yours truly. Thank you for listening. See you next week.